Okay. I have to figure out how to turn that thing off in the middle of it.
It's recording either way, you're fine.
Yeah, but I want to be able to see you.
Oh, right.
Anything goes wrong. All right. Got it. All right. Ready to go, darling?
Yep.
Okay. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica is one of the landmarks in the history of Western thought. In some ways, he's batting cleanup for the entire Middle Ages, the entire period intellectually, from the fall of Rome in roughly 476 to his own life. And he was active from, he was born about 1225 and he dies about 50 years later. So he's living in the middle of the 13th century. And it's often misunderstood. And the period between the fall of Rome and the emergence of the Italian Renaissance is sometimes thought of as being a period of intellectual stasis, when ideas are entirely dogmatic and the virtue of critical skepticism has been replaced by a thoughtless and coercive religiosity. I'm not convinced of this. The person who convinced me that this view of particularly the late Middle Ages, the time of Aquinas, that this is wrong, was Michael Mann in his magisterial four-volume work on the sources of social power. It's an amazing achievement. But he thinks that the dynamism characteristic of the West, particularly the cultural transformations, don't start, say, 1400, 1350. In fact, he dates it to 1100. Now, I think that's a little optimistic, but certainly by 1150, all right, we are seeing a transformation in Western culture. Let me give you some sense of how great these transformations are. If you look back at the early Middle Ages and you look at a text like the Song of Roland, what's funny in some ways, or sad in some ways, about the Song of Roland is that the troubadours and bards who constructed this epic turned out to produce very admirable propaganda for the First Crusade, which was called in 1096. So several generations of troubadours had been working on this story, and it was the story about Charlemagne being attacked in his rear guard, and Roland, the heroic nephew of Charlemagne, fights and defeats what are called the Saracens. And the Saracens are diabolical. They're the inverse of the gracious and moral crusaders. The Song of Roland treats Islam as a polytheistic religion. All right, so there are three deities that they're supposed to worship, and they're also connected to black magic. Now, that's being written about 1050, and it reaches its final form a couple of generations later. Now, let's stop and think about 1150. In 1150, we have a very different intellectual context. Part of it is the interaction between Christianity and Islam in the Crusades. But apart from medicine, I'm not sure that all that much comes from there. Where the interaction is much more fruitful for the West is the Reconquista, which is performed by Christian armies gradually pushing Islamic armies and Islamic inhabitants out of the Iberian Peninsula back into North Africa. Now, this took about 700 years. It didn't finish until 1492. And we know what happens when a little money from that process got freed up. They went and discovered America, at least the European discovery. Well, here's the point. Thomas Aquinas has certain advantages over the troubadours from a century and a half earlier. In the first place, universities have developed. Now, this is of huge institutional importance because it creates something like a research institute and an ongoing series of discussions. And it is not, as we might suspect, an institution connected to a particular location. Granted, there's a University of Padua, there's a university at Oxford, there's a university at Cambridge and at Paris. But what these really were was scholars' guilds. And that meant if the scholars didn't get along with the rulers of the city, they might well, and sometimes did, just pick up and leave. So we can't imagine NYU leaving New York, but it is entirely possible for the scholars of, say, the University of Bologna to decide that they want to set out for greener pastures. So town and gown conflicts were very important, but it also created an institutional basis for large-scale intellectual cooperation. Professors from one of these universities often traveled to another as a kind of visiting professor. They would go on horseback. But the point is that there was an influx of new books and new ideas. And that's what we see in Thomas Aquinas. You may think of it as Thomas's work, the Summa Theologica, as a giant book of theology. But a more accurate way of thinking about it is as an encyclopedia. Everything that's important and everything that can be known and everything that's been written can be found or should be found in Aquinas. Since Aquinas studied at the University of Padua, he will have read things that the Song of Roland poets never got access to. Aquinas had read the Quran. The Song of Roland poets have not. Aquinas has an understanding of Islamic thought. He knows Al-Farabi and cites him. He knows Averroes. He knows Al-Kindi. He knows a fair chunk of the Islamic intellectual tradition. And in addition, there's also, in the process of the Reconquista, a gradual appropriation of Islamic libraries. And there's a big business in translating these books into Latin, because that's the universal language of intellectuals in the Christian part of Western Europe. So the point is that Aquinas lives in a time that is very dynamic. He knows things that his very near predecessors do not. He, for example, has read the great Rabbi Maimonides. He appears to know Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. It is hard to imagine someone doing that a century earlier, but on the other hand, and appropriating Jewish knowledge or appropriating Islamic knowledge, and also appropriating Greek and Roman knowledge. Now, into that stew, it seems that Aquinas has read everything accessible. He's a book eater. He's a bibliophage. The number of things he's read and the capacity of his memory are just astonishing to me. Remember that he didn't have Google, so when he needed to cite scripture, he did it from his encyclopedic memory of the Old and New Testaments. In addition to that, he knew Islamic thought. He knew Jewish thought. He knew Roman thought. He knew the early Christian patristics like Augustine. And he also knew these earlier scholastic contemporaries like Anselm. So in other words, this is possibly one of the biggest and most encyclopedic brains since Aristotle. So when you look at the Summa Theologica, what you need to keep in mind is that it's a summary of everything that's in the medieval world. He's batting cleanup for Islam, for Christianity, for Judaism, for the Romans, for the Greeks. He is trying to sum it all up in one coherent framework. Now, what kind of framework do we have here? The framework here is a kind of cellular structure. The Summa is a kind of frozen Platonism where Aquinas proposes a question and then he proposes wrong interpretations or wrong answers. And he cites the relevant possibilities only to destroy them because they're straw men. So immediately after offering us the wrong answers, then we get the right answer with the appropriate authorities who got it right. And he's not ashamed to learn from anybody. So he cites Islamic writers, he cites Jewish writers, he cites Greeks, he cites Romans, and of course, he cites Aristotle with a particular centrality, because Aristotle is the most comprehensive kind of thinker. And what Aquinas is trying to do is synthesize Western thought in the way that Aristotle attempted to synthesize Greek thought. And he's going to borrow many ideas from Aristotle, particularly ideas about morality. Those of you who know the Nicomachean Ethics will know that habit is very important, and moral virtues are a matter of prudence. And much that was in Aristotle gets transformed and reformulated in a Christian context. So whenever there's an inconsistency, as Aquinas understands it, between what Aristotle thinks and what God commands, God always wins out. But since Aristotle is such a great philosopher, he gets most of it right. He does as much as he can do with natural reason. So the differences between Aquinas and Aristotle is that Aquinas is bringing in the idea of scripture and the tradition of thinking that comes from Jerusalem, not just Athens. Okay. Now, Aquinas's memory and intelligence are truly astonishing when you realize that he's pulling all these things up, either looking for a citation or remembering it. And finally, once we get the answer with the wrong answers and the right answers with authority, he says, I answer that ... and then he gives you the unvarnished truth as he understands it. Now, he might thereafter give specific refutations of interesting ways of being wrong. But for the most part, what he's interested in doing is formulating a question, responding to the question in one or two or three articles, generally speaking. And each of these articles has that cellular form. When I was rereading and looking at the Summa a few weeks ago, it sort of struck me as being something like the Great Barrier Reef, in the sense that it's all these tiny cellular structures, but there's so many of them, the book kind of writes itself. And Aquinas didn't stop working on the Summa until he had run through 3,170 odd articles. That's a lot of writing. The most important English translation that we have now is 5 volumes. And it's unfinished. After looking at it, the more I look at it, the more I think that it's unfinishable. In other words, what Aquinas is doing is something, I think, like working out the decimal expansion of pi. It gets longer and longer, and you get further and further from where you started, but you don't get any closer to the end. Toward the end of his life, Aquinas was saying Mass and had some sort of mystical illumination. And then he stopped writing and stopped doing philosophy until some months thereafter he died. But what he said was, given what I have seen, all I have written is straw. And I think that one way of thinking about that is that he had realized that the decimal expansion of pi just goes on and on and on. So Aquinas is going to give us an encyclopedia of medieval thought. It's going to be organized not by the way we would organize the encyclopedia, by alphabetical order. His encyclopedic work is organized around the perfect universal hierarchy ordained by God. So the book starts with God, all right? The first section is about God and his creation and, angels and human beings and all that sort of stuff. And remember, at this point, the Garden of Eden is the best knowledge we have for human origins. Then the second part is man's telos, his purpose and his happiness. And his telos, taken from Aristotle, is that he wants to be happy. So far, so good. It sounds like just something lifted from Aristotle. But Aquinas insists that man's true happiness is the beatific vision, to go to heaven, ascend because your soul is pure, and see the face of God. So this is the Christian element that gets welded on to Aristotle's idea that all human beings want to be happy. Now, when he talks about human beings' capacities and their purpose, he talks about the virtues, and particularly he gives us insightful observations about faith, hope, and charity, which are the Christian theological virtues. And they're different from the schedule of virtues we got with Plato, where we needed wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. But I actually like both of those tables of law. And I like both of those ideas. And I see the attraction in trying to find some middle ground that integrates them both. And then in the third part of the Summa, we've done God and we've done man. What we then do is Jesus and the sacraments. Why? Because Jesus is both God and man. So we established God first, who's on the top of the big hierarchy. We established man in between lesser animals and God and the angels. That's called the great chain of being. And when we go to Jesus, we get a confluence, a dovetailing of the first two books to talk about the unique qualities of the incarnation. Now, his breadth of knowledge is absolutely breathtaking. You could easily spend a lifetime studying this. When I went back and looked at it, I saw so many things that I didn't see the last time I looked at it, because I have been reading Islamic thought and reading Jewish thought. And this is deeply influenced. It's like a giant intellectual cathedral. I mean, it's majestic, it's outside the human scale, and it has architectural details that are drawn from every building that ever existed. In other words, the Greeks, the Romans, the patristics, the early Christian fathers, the early medievals, the Muslim thinkers, the Jewish thinkers. In other words, everything is grist for his mill. And so you see off on one side, if you think of it as a cathedral, you see a section that looks remarkably like a mosque. And there are other times when I see a section that looks, well, strangely like a Christianized synagogue. And not only that, we get Greek temples and we get the various kinds of Greek demands for aesthetic order and the Roman demand for permanence. So it's a unique kind of intellectual construction. If you could imagine some giant who could build an entire Gothic cathedral, who could build Notre Dame by himself, well, that's almost what we have here with Aquinas. He is for his age, he is the master of them that know. There seems to be nothing that isn't fit for his integration into his giant system. And this is the state of human knowledge at the time that Aquinas is writing. And so the number of things in there is fascinating. There's all sorts of complex and delicately worked out ideas. There's a lot of subtlety there and nuance that I didn't see the first time I looked at it, or the second for that matter. I want to point out, though, that the late Middle Ages, and Aquinas is the kind of central intellectual figure of the late Middle Ages, was actually the first part of the Renaissance. Okay, we have tremendous intellectual change, and many of these intellectual changes became integrated into the society we live in today. I'll talk about those, but think about how fast things are changing as early as Aquinas, right? He's a rough contemporary of Fibonacci. If you know the Fibonacci spiral, he is a mathematician of extraordinary gifts. He's so gifted that he sees that the Hindu Arabic system of numerals, the ones we use on our clock faces today, that's a much better system because it makes calculation a great deal easier. And I know it will sound strange, but the actual form that your representation of quantities take can influence your ability to manipulate them. Think about it this way. Try doing on a pencil with a pencil and paper 49 times 51. all right, using the Hindu Arabic numerals you do. Now, what I want you to do is write out those same two numbers in Roman numerals. Then I want you to do the multiplication problem. Can you see that's going to be a lot harder problem? So the advent of new mathematics is important. The invention of the mechanical clock allowed for time to be divided into publicly observable, much smaller units than the day, which had previously been central to people's time reckoning. So mechanical clocks, optics also become important. The first spectacles, glasses to change, to make nearsightedness or farsightedness improve, come in about the time of Aquinas, the 1200s. And this is largely derived from the Arabic tradition of optics. But the theory of vision and the mathematics of optics turned out to be hugely important, because in another couple of centuries, the telescope and the microscope are going to be the product of these optical advances. So it's a big step forward to invent eyeglasses. I know it sounds funny, it's always been there, but it hasn't. Another thing that gets developed around this time is musical notation. They didn't have a way of writing down tone and rhythm, so they had to invent one for church singing, for Gregorian chant. In addition, what else? We got a whole collection of new ideas in medicine. And Aquinas is the inheritor of a great tradition, but also he's living during a time of enormous intellectual ferment. For the first time, books start to get tables of contents. The reason why is because prior to that, books were so rare and so few, there's no point in telling you what's going to come here, because if you're a reader at all, you're going to read the 11 books accessible to you at the at the school library or at the court. So remember that at this time, books were very few. They tended to be in the form of treatises, and Aquinas is giving us the treatise of treatises. That's what he's trying to do. Now, you may wonder, what's the payoff on this? How does this help you think? Well, first case, we're eventually going to be looking at Dante. And you can't understand Dante's hierarchy of the universe unless you realize that this is a poetic reflection of the great chain of being that Aquinas takes for granted. So we get God at the top, and Aquinas, of course, starts at the top and then moves down. Dante decides he's going to start at the bottom in hell and then work his way up. But when you look at the different sins that Dante recognizes and also the different virtues that he recognizes, you'll find that much of this is derived from Aquinas' discussion of human vice and human virtue and sin and redemption. And people have said that Dante is Aquinas made readable. And I think that's a bit of an uncharitable thought, but it's very helpful to know Aquinas if you're going to be reading Dante. But let me talk about a couple of things that are still in existence. Actually, I'm glad that they are still in existence. First is an idea that I think is a very subtle one. It's a smart one. It's called the principle of double effect. What this means is that it is morally permissible to perform actions that have side effects that are not morally permissible. Let me explain what he means by that. St. Augustine had some doubts about whether people had a right to self-defense. In other words, if someone comes up to you and threatens to kill you, do you have a right, cowboy style, to draw your gun and shoot him first? There's a sort of pacifist strain in Christianity, which I could see rejecting a right to self-defense. But I think that's rather crude and rather inhumane. Aquinas says, no, let me explain this in a more subtle way. Murder is a vice, and the best you can ever say about it is that it's a necessary evil. Any individual is entitled to protect themselves from unlawful harm. So when somebody tries to kill you, or when somebody tries to break into your home, you're entitled to defend yourself and your family. It's not that you have a right to kill people arbitrarily. Even if you were to meet that burglar on the street, you don't have a right to kill him. But there are circumstances in which a violent outsider threatens you or threatens your family, and then you are entitled to shoot him, you are entitled to use force, but you are not entitled to intend to kill him. In other words, if it's possible to hit him with a taser rather than a shotgun, you do that. On the other hand, you are entitled to take action to prevent harm to yourself. If you're the innocent party, or your family is the innocent party, or a stranger is, you're entitled to help them out. That's a very sophisticated idea. And I think it's something we want to hold on to in our thinking about right and wrong. The next thing would be the fallenness of man. Now, I'm not interested in insisting on Genesis. What I am interested in is the symbol, the idea of the fallenness of man. What that means is this: human beings, unlike the Greeks, Christians think that human beings are not perfectible. Remember that Christians believe in original sin. So if human beings are not perfectible, that means that perfectionistic political programs are unavailing. They're a waste of time. On the other hand, Plato and the other Greek thinkers often have an idea, explicit or implicit, about what an ideal human being would be. And they emphasize human inequality. And Aquinas is transforming that. Augustine has already done that, but Aquinas is actually integrating that Augustinian set of perspectives into his overarching system. And he says, look, what we mean by the fallenness of man was, of course, the first sin, but also it means that there is no organization of society or organization of the self that can create a perfect individual or a perfect group. We are intrinsically flawed. Plato would say, why? I mean, if you teach them enough math and a whole bunch of other great stuff, by the time they're 35, they'll never do anything wrong again. Ask yourself which is more realistic. And I'm actually thinking that the Christian idea of the fallenness of man is much more consistent with my understanding of history than the idea of human perfectibility, which is terrifying when it comes up short. That's where you're going to get the terror of the French Revolution. Another important distinction, which Aquinas borrows and extends Augustine, in which he extends Augustine, is the idea of just and unjust wars. That not every war is morally justifiable, but as in the case of the law of the principle of double effect, if you are attacked and you are innocent of wrongdoing, not only does the individual have the right to defend themselves, but societies have the right to defend themselves. So what it means is that wars of aggression, like we're seeing now in the Ukraine, wars and especially wars of extermination, which have been so terribly prevalent throughout so much of history, neither of those are acceptable for Christians. And there's a whole list of things, of qualities and properties that you have to meet in order to have a just war. I would say that the Ukrainians right now are fighting a just war, regardless of whatever mistakes made prior to the war by all sides. When tanks come rolling through your hometown, you do have a right to defend yourself. So the difference between just and unjust wars, I think that would have fallen flat with most of the Romans. I mean, for a long time, they were a predatory military empire. And, like the Spartans, but on a longer time frame, they were in the war business, enslaving their neighbors and then demanding tribute. Christians aren't allowed to do that. Final thing that I wanted to talk about, this is, I would say, that maybe the most important legacy of Aquinas. And like every other big legacy, there's much here that's derived, and in this case, it's derived from Roman Stoicism. I'm talking about Aquinas's employment of the idea of natural law. Here, I don't mean natural law in the sense that F equals MA, right? I don't mean a physical law. What I mean is a moral law, which is equally accessible to the rational mind. So in other words, Aquinas, like the Roman Stoics, think that a rational understanding of right and wrong is accessible to all people by virtue of their human rationality. So we have a kind of initial move in that direction, a universal moral law that exists within nature and is accessible through reason. We get that in say Marcus Aurelius or in Epictetus. On the other hand, when Aquinas takes up this idea, what he does is supplement the idea of natural reason with a natural moral law, which is indicated by scripture. Let me see if I can show you what I mean by that. The Stoics would say, if someone threatens your family, you have a right to defend yourself and your family. But I think that they would be at a loss to understand the parable of the Good Samaritan. In other words, pointless compassion, not logically derived from your own self-interest. I think that they wouldn't have had a clear conception of that. What they're doing is trying to reconcile a subjection to nature with a rational tranquility. Well, that's a great Roman achievement. What Aquinas does, since he's read the Romans and the Greeks and everybody else, is he brings that up. He says, that's just what we need. We're going to add to the Roman idea of natural law. We're going to add scripture, and we're going to add Christian charity. And this charity will be universal, and it will be it will not be self-interested, except in the sense that it might get you to heaven. So what Aquinas is doing is invoking and formalizing the idea that it's going to turn into something like the law of nations, right? The United Nations Charter recognizes something like a law of nations. So does the International Criminal Court. And this turns out to be a very handy idea. Let me try and give you an example. The end of World War II, the Nazi death camps were discovered, and the atrocities that were committed, at least some of them, were brought to justice. And at the time, Stalin couldn't figure out why the Westerners wanted to have a trial of the Nazis. He said, instead, let's kill the 100,000 highest ranking Nazi officers. That's for starts. We don't need a trial. We need 100,000 bullets. Well, that's one way of looking at retributive justice. But the Westerners were insistent that we have some kind of judicial proceeding so we can distinguish between, for example, the guilty and the innocent. Stalin says, don't waste your time, 100,000 bullets. Okay, one of the easiest jobs at the Nuremberg trials was as the Soviet representative among the judges, because he voted to convict everybody and then to give them all the maximum sentence, which was as close as 100,000 bullets as you could get. But now let's think about what the Americans and the Brits and the French demanded. They wanted a trial, and they had trials. And some of these high-ranking Nazis were found guilty of war crimes and of crimes against humanity and were sentenced to death or imprisonment. Some of them were actually let go, but not most. Now, here's the most important thing here. One of the points that the Nazi Defense Council made was that they hadn't broken any law. In fact, there is no black letter positive law in the Third Reich that says you're not allowed to exterminate people, right? So the fact that the regime for which they worked was hierarchical, one guy took orders from another and gave them to another, that was taken to be enough for legitimate activity. In other words, mere legality was taken to be sufficient. Now, mere legality turned out to be insufficient. That's the position of legal positivists, who say the law is the law. It has nothing to do with morality. The Americans and the British and the Canadians and the Australians and all the winning side wanted to put the relevant people on trial. And then they wanted to distinguish between the innocent and the guilty. But the problem was, what law were they breaking? In other words, you can't have a judicial proceeding unless somebody's broken some law. And the problem is that the laws that were covering German nationals then didn't prevent them from obeying the orders of their military superior. So what the Nuremberg trials had to do was revive this old Stoic and Christian idea of natural moral law. Here's the thing, you're not supposed to kill the people in the house next to you. Another idea would be that you're not supposed to kill your parents. Another would be that you're not supposed to rape your children. Another would be that you're not supposed to steal other people's homes. Point is, Aquinas doesn't think that these are a matter of opinion or feeling or perspective. What Aquinas believes is these are moral facts, that they refer to what is good for and what achieves the true happiness of human beings. And for him, it's like it comes from the telos of human beings. What's good for us is to be happy. What makes us happy is seeing the face of God, the beatific vision. Well, the 20th century is somewhat uneasy with those ideas, but they're implicit in the idea that there exists a moral law by which you can send Nazis to the gallows. Otherwise, there's no law to break and there's no court to have. And that would mean that Stalin was right. So here you're faced with a very powerful bifurcation. The people who are legal positivists say, look, the law is just something people make up. It's a convention, which was a view that was held by the Stoics and also held by Stalin. That means that when it's handy, you can always get rid of law and just act lawlessly. On the other hand, there's the idea of freedom as autonomy, which means recognition of political and moral law and a connection between political and moral law. That was what Plato was seeking. Now, this is the way in which the Nazis were tried. Instead of saying, let's look at the German code of laws and see if putting people in concentration camps and then in ovens was specifically prohibited. Well, the Western powers said, we don't care whether it was specifically prohibited. This is contrary to the natural moral obligations that human beings owe to one another. And it is important to affirm these things, because otherwise we go back to that lawless Hobbesian state where we are faced with either admitting that there is a natural moral law or Stalin's 100,000 bullets. So there's much to find interesting in Aquinas. I hope you enjoy his proofs of God's existence and his advocacy of human equality as being unnatural. Again, that's a characteristically Christian idea, but try not to view Aquinas' Summa as a kind of hard, impassable coral reef. Beneath that coral, there are these living cells of things that keep on expanding until they surround Australia. And the reason why Aquinas wrote a gigantic series of tomes, but was never able to finish, is because the attempt to give an account of everything is intrinsically flawed. It has to do with the fallenness of man.